Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, October 6, 2016. The Nefarium has been busy, and particularly if you've been watching the American selection process, the referendum on globalism versus nationalism. And if you've been watching the U.S. lamestream media, you've also been getting a steady diet of war hysteria. There are actually people talking about going to war with Russia over their intervention in Syria. And of course, only the great Darth Hillary and her evil Sith apprentice Lord Darth Soros can have the wisdom and experience to lead us through the crisis with the evil Prince Mad Vlad. But anyway, I'm joking, of course. But I do want to put this article that I want to talk about in that context of all the war hysteria going on and make a suggestion as to how to look at all of this. But there's an article now that is really interesting from Russia Insider that I want to bring to your attention this week. I'm going to be reading a lot of this article and then commenting and placing it in the context. And this article shows you just what a disaster American foreign policy under the Obama administration, and particularly under the Darth Hillary regime, have been. And I want to read several paragraphs from you. The article is titled, Russia Asked to Intervene in Libya, Gaining Clout in the Middle East. This appeared in the Strategic Culture Foundation on Sunday, October 2nd. So just 4 days ago, the article is by Peter Korzun. Let me quote. Libya's military leader Khalifa Haftar, the commander of the Libyan National Army, loyal to the Tobruk-based House of Representatives, has requested Russia to end its arms embargo on Libya and begin supplying weapons and military equipment to eastern Libyan forces. According to the Russian newspaper Izvestia, Abdulbasit Badri, Haftar's special representative, who also serves as Libya's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, visited Moscow on September 22nd to deliver the request addressed both to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Mr. Badri held talks with Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov, Russian newspaper Izvestia reported, citing a diplomatic source familiar with the situation. The agenda included the prospects for lifting the embargo on arms supplies, including warplanes. More importantly, General Haftar asked Russia to start an anti-Islamist military operation in Libya similar to the one in Syria. That's very important, folks, and I'm going to comment on it when I get done. The toppling of long-term leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 led to a power vacuum and instability in Libya with no authority in full control. The country is divided between two governments, the House of Representatives in the east of the country and the Government of National Accord, which has moved to Tripoli in March 2016 and set up its headquarters in a heavily guarded naval base. A large part of Tripoli is held by Islamists. The division prompted the United Nations to launch negotiations aimed at forming a unified government and army to face the growing threat of terror groups. In September, Libya's rival governments were reported to have reached a consensus on the main elements of a political agreement. Now, I'm going to skip all the way toward the end of this article and read you two very important paragraphs that appear right toward the end of this article. Quote, the most important thing is that Russia, not the U.S., France, or any other Western state involved in the Libya conflict, is that it is the Libyan military leader has asked for help from Russia. Libyans well remember the NATO intervention of 2011, which led to this mess, all right? Remember cackling Darth Hillary? We saw he died, all right? Led to the NATO intervention of 2011, and don't trust the West. These are Libyans, especially in view of its failure to achieve any positive result in Syria. And again, let's remember what the real story here in Syria is, folks. It is the United States that has fostered and supported the terrorist groups trying to topple Assad. So from my point of view, folks, war on terror, baloney. All right. And the Libyans, of course, are now asking Russia for help. The collapse of the recent Russia-U.S. agreement on Syria and following tragedy in Aleppo confirms the fact for the Libyans. Besides, unlike the U.S., Russia enjoys a good relationship with Egypt and working relations with the United Arab Emirates, the countries that back General Haftar. The request for help and to intervene in Libya testifies to the fact that Russia's clout is growing in the Middle East, while the West is displaying unwillingness to play a responsible role in the region. The operation in Syria was followed with a host of tangible Middle East policy successes. Russia has built special relationships with Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and the Persian Gulf states, and King Salman of Saudi Arabia is planning a trip to Moscow soon. Russia is strongly back in the region with its clout growing by leaps and bounds, while the U.S. appears to have lost its way in the regional maze of overlapping problems and complexities. Well, no, what the U.S. has done largely during the Obama administration, beginning in the previous Bush administration, is to destabilize the entire region and to back the most criminal, extraordinary, fundamentalist elements in the region. And of course, Saudi Arabia would be right up there. And we have not stabilized the region at all. This is the problem. We've gone in and done exactly the opposite. So in other words, there is a link, at least in many people's minds, between the United States and the spread of Wahhabist terrorism. Now, all of this occurs, this is my real point, all of this is occurring as we've seen Russia holding immense nuclear and thermonuclear drills involving all of its strategic nuclear forces. And these drills have also involved about 40 million people within the Russian population taking part in these drills, going into the shelters, and so on. Now, that's the first question I want to ask you. Why is it that Russia has actually built shelters for its civilian population? And when was the last time you saw a fallout shelter or even anything closely approximating it for the civil defense of the American population in the United States? That ought to lead to some questions. So in other words, there's been this war hysteria because of these Russian drills. Then you had General Kinney going before, I believe it was Kinney, going before the United States Congress, or General Dunford, one of the two, and being asked the question, what would it take to get the Russians out of Syria and to establish a no-fly zone over Syria? And the general's response was, well, to do that, we would be at war with Russia. Okay, so there's been this building war hysteria in the United States. And there is speculation, especially for those of you abroad in Europe or in the Pacific that are listening to the American elections, and especially for those of you in Africa that are following all of this. There's this hysteria right now in the United States that the elite is so desperate to get Darth Hillary elected that they will do just about anything, and there is talk even of starting a war with Russia in order to keep the status quo going. That's how crazy it is, all right? I call it the hysteria index, which is the index on the right, on the political right in this country, that assumes that they're that nuts. It's the right-wing counterpart of the lunacy index, which we see coming out of the Democratic Party, all right? And yes, I said Democratic Party, all right? Now, here's the problem. I don't think they're going to be that stupid for one very fundamental reason. Recall also that in this context, I think it was James Kirby of the U.S. State Department issued this long statement that if Russia didn't mind its own business, This could soon lead to complications involving Russian citizens and, his own words, perhaps even terrorist attacks on Russian soil. All right. So, in other words, we'll use our covert Islamic radical cutouts to bring terrorism home to Russia in a major way. Russia's response, of course, was any threat against Russian civilians is absolutely, unconditionally non-negotiable. All right, that was Russia's response. So there's this war hysteria. Now, let's assume for a moment that this does spiral out of control and become a regional, large-scale war. I am going to suggest to you that this is the last thing that the elites want. This is the last thing that a Darth Soros or a Darth Hillary or any of the long list of criminals in the neocon wing of the American deep state would want, for the simple reason that if they start playing covert wars with Russia directly, Russia will respond in kind. And that means that they themselves, in my opinion, and their families will become the targets of Russian wet operations. In other words, assassination. So, in other words, I think that they have to be very, very careful if they're going to consider this for their own personal well-being, and here's why. The Russians, you'll notice, have been responding in a very low-key way to all of these American and Western provocations. And the Russians themselves, as I've been arguing for many years, not only in these talks, not only in interviews, but in my books, the Russians are well aware that their real struggle is not with the American people. Their real struggle is with an international deep state, if you will, represented by certain people that have been doing these things and orchestrating these crises. So, in other words, the Russian response there and all of this request for intervention is the growing awareness, in my opinion, that these people, especially in the Middle East, who've been victimized by all of this and placed in the center of it, that these people are waking up to the fact that it is an international class that is the problem. This is why Putin is so very important to listen to when he says that the problem is we do not want a unipolar world run by multinational corporations. This is the result. All right, this is the result. The Hillary Clintons, George Soros's, Rothschilds, Rockefeller group, this is the result. And Russia, I think, has now, in a very interesting way, in its response to all these crises, and particularly to that crisis, statement by Kirby at the State Department, that Russia better watch it or they themselves could be targeted. Russia's response that Russian citizens are not negotiable or targets. I think that was a response letting them know that if this does spiral into that kind of war situation, that Russian special forces, Russian on-the-ground agents, Russian sleeper cells, and possibly even Chinese will target those global elites personally. So that's my particular view for thinking that this is more hysteria being kind of hyped up in the Western media. I'm not saying the situation is not real. I'm not saying the situation is not serious. But the situation is of the West making, and Russia says, no, you're not going to get away with that. We will defend ourselves. So that's an interesting speculative reading of all of this. I expect that I'll be blogging about some of this in the coming days in a little more depth. I have yet to go through my emails. But that article about Libya now requesting help, that demonstrates just how low the American foreign policy and America have sunk in the eyes of most people, and particularly in the eyes of the moderate Arab states, the secular Islamic states. We have been fostering and sponsoring everybody but those people who would have been our natural allies. In other words, we've been creating more terrorism than we've been resolving. And Russia has stepped in and is playing the opposite role. So this could get very, very delicate, very, very interesting real fast. That's it for our news and views from the Nefarium for Thursday, October 6, 2016. I'll see everybody on the flip side. Bye-bye, and God bless.